honor to be here. Fun to be here. And so I want to talk a little bit about nature and technology, wearable computing and augmented reality, and humanistic intelligence is the main framework, HI, humanistic intelligence, and surveillance systems. So first, I just want to briefly mention some of the ventures that have come out of this philosophy or way of thinking. Meta, augmented reality, eyeglasses, we raised 73 million. And our chief technology officer, so I'm the chief scientist and one of the co-founders, and I have here another co-founder with me, Raymond. Do you want to stand up? And big applause for Raymond.
Hi, everybody. Well, I've been working with Steve for the last 10 years. It was a really interesting venture. You see, first day I saw him wearing this into the class and tell me he can see Wi-Fi. I'm not going to ruin his talk, but definitely he can see beyond a lot of things we can see today. And I'm very glad to be here. And if you're interested in Meta, come say hi to me today, and we're hiring.
Yes, we're looking for very, very smart people and creative people. And then another company that we co-founded that I was involved with, myself and some of my students and so on, we founded Interaxon, brainwave sensing company, and raised 17 million. This is our product here. I'll just grab that for a second and pass this around. So we sell this in Best Buy stores across North America now, and Indigo and so on. And this is a transparent version, so you can see inside it. The ones that we sell are, different colors, but usually not transparent. But anyway, I'll pass this around so everybody can see. It's got 5 electrode points on the front that contact, and then you can plug additional electrodes into the back for various areas. And it doesn't require, many of you have seen pictures of me where I shaved off my hair and bonded a skull cap permanently to my head with implanted electrodes, but you don't really need that. This will work with a big fuzzy hairstyle, and you don't need any electrode gel. It just slips on comfortably and easily and quickly. Another company, Visioner Tech, we're doing HDR, vision, and splash tones. We make underwater pipe organs, underwater musical instruments, sort of an early example of a natural user interface, and Lucent HDR, welding to see welding vision. All of these companies are founded from one key principle: humanistic intelligence. Instead of AI, we have HI. And this is from a paper that Ray Kurzweil, the chief engineer of Google, Marvin Minsky, the father of AI, and myself, the 3 of us, wrote in 2013. That humanistic intelligence arises by having the human being in the feedback loop of the computational process in which the human and computer are inextricably intertwined. And this creates an intelligence that matches our own biological brain, something more powerful emerging from this, namely a synergy between human and computer that makes this sort of super intelligent cyborg being. So it's a fundamental concept that's based on, if we look at the 6 signal flow paths between human and machine, think the human I've denoted as a circle because people are kind of round, and the computer I've denoted as a square because computers are kind of angular, but without loss of generality here. I mean, typically computers are built into clothing, so they're also round and squishy. But anyway, you've got the human and the machine, and the humans have senses and effectors, and the machines have sensors and actuators. And so you might say that there are a total of 4 signal flow paths. Humans and computers have their inputs and outputs. But I specifically in HI theory is we segregate those portions of the computer's output that are going into the human and those portions of the human that are going into the computer, because some of those senses that we have sense the environment around us, and a portion of that sensory capacity is devoted to sensing the computer. So I've specifically segregated those elements. And in particular, when we're being watched, that's called surveillance. That's a French word. What does that mean in English? Does anybody know English, French here? And how to translate it into English? Surveillance. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire en anglais? Yeah. Yeah, it's a French origin word, but give me like a really nice English word that sort of... Yes, overlooking, or a really good English word is oversight. Overwatching or oversight. And so surveillance is overwatching. And so when we're being watched over as suspects or whatever, or simply the machine's watching us. And so that's surveillance. And in control theory, we have this notion of controllability and observability, and you need both of them. The counterpart to this is surveillance. That's a word that I made up. Ça veut dire en anglais undersight. And so we have here these 6 flow paths, and you need all 6 of them in order to have a successful implementation of HI. If one of them is missing or impaired, then that's a problem. Now, where the problem mostly arises is in valence. If you take the word surveillance and take away the first 3 letters, it just means sight or watching, valence. And in particular, just to make a point of this, I made a piece, an art installation, that violates the principle of humanistic intelligence because it's so commonly done in industry now. In fact, I grew up when I could understand things and they were easy to use and everything was immediate. My computer booted in a fraction of a second and everything was instant. And then we sort of entered the dark ages of computing when things became bad. And I think that to facilitate that, to show that, I made a digital light switch. Push once to turn it on and push once to turn it off with a random 3 to 5 second delay, but sometimes up to 10 or 15 seconds even. You know, the delay was kind of random. And so then with a 90% batting average, so that about 10% of the time it would ignore the press. And so people would come into my office, they'd push the light switch and nothing would happen, and they would push it again, and then I could say, "You idiot, you just turned the light on and off again. You have to push it and then wait." And they would ask me how long, and I'd say, "Well, you know, maybe 3 to 5 seconds, but sometimes you have to wait a little longer." And so this is what I was thinking of: machines of malice, the digital light switch, being digital. Now my daughter, my 6-year-old daughter, made this understandable because everybody was saying, what does surveillance mean? What does surveillance mean? So I said, what's there to not understand about that? And in fact, we created, this is a necklace I made back in 1998. And I made it to look like a surveillance camera. And then it captures everything with a fisheye lens, and it's got sensors in it that senses all kinds of physiological and environmental qualities. And then Microsoft kind of grabbed onto this idea a few years later, and then Momoto actually made it into a successful product. And we can think of these as scale here. We can think of this in terms of scale. At the origin, I've got bits, atoms, and genes. And further out, bits is computer science. As we go further from the origin, atoms is geography and physical sciences, and genes, beams, memes, and the social sciences. And so we've got these 3 axes: alpha, because atom is a Greek word, and bits is beta, and genes is gamma. And so these 3 axes represent the physical and social-political and computational scale of things. So a smart city comes, the word urban, is a Greek concept of city. And then we've got province, country, or state, country, earth, universe, and so on. And coming in, we've got neighborhood, street, building, clothes, body, organs inside the body, cellular biology, and we have what's inside. And the green stuff is the environment. That's what surrounds us. And I've colored in flesh tones our own body, which is not the environment. That's us. I call it the environment. And this whole scale, I'll call it the environment. Just take the first 2 letters off the word environment. So the environment is the environment and the environment. In other words, the physical scale that we're looking at here. And then we've got the social political scale, which is surveillance versus surveillance. Surveillance is the small individual, couple, family, team, community, corporation, nation, world government, and even the law of outer space. So bureaucracy can get pretty big now when you talk about space law. And so we got surveillance as the small things and surveillance as the big things, roughly speaking. These are all up for debate. But, the idea is that we've got the environment, we have valence, and we've got virtuality. Environment, valence, and virtuality that can occur at multiple scales. And so this is kind of the philosophical framework. And if I had to summarize one sort of aphorism that I'll propose to make this understandable by the layperson, HI, is that feedback delayed is feedback denied. When I try to turn off my TV to tell the kids to go to bed, I used to fix TVs in my childhood. I was the guy that everybody came to with their TV when it wouldn't be working, and I used to, in my early childhood, I fixed televisions and learned a lot about televisions and turned them into oscilloscopes and did all kinds of fun stuff. Now I can't even figure out how to turn off the TV because when I push the button, nothing happens. So I figure I haven't pushed it hard enough, so I hit it a little harder and harder and harder and harder until... You see, that's the problem, is sometimes it's 15 seconds. But anyway. And then I push it and maybe wait an hour and it's still not off. So finally I unplug it. And so I thought, well, it doesn't give you instant feedback. It doesn't tell you right away. So I'd love to be the CEO of a TV company and just have a big sledgehammer and they bring me TVs and I can say, okay, yes or no. I got to hit it harder and harder and harder. And then eventually somebody will bring me a TV that immediately acknowledges the fact that I've pressed it. So these machines know everything about us but reveal nothing about itself. The TV has a camera in there. It's watching my facial expression. It knows everything about me. And then yet it's not even telling me whether or not I've pushed its on-off switch. So I had this idea of software-free computing. And software as a general pejorative term for anything, including things in the real physical world that are unreliable. You know, we say that's so software. And so here's a little art piece I made. License to Sit, San Francisco Art Institute, 2001. 23 spikes that retract when you download a seating license. And then I had like 6 chairs around a table, and you could download a 2-seat floating license. And so you could sit at any 2 positions. And then that way you only pay for the seating that you actually use. And so this is kind of looks at what happens if the real world emulates software. Here it is here. And I don't know if the sound, I'll just... Let's get my credit card here. Quality of seating provision, QoS provision.
Oh, yeah, like those dark hemispheres up on the ceiling. Yeah, which one you want to do? Not at the bottom, Marty. You don't think the cameras might make people feel uncomfortable? No, I do.
The license is about to expire. So that's kind of my impression of software. And so this was kind of a vision. You know, they asked me for an exhibit on wearable computing, San Francisco Art Institute, and this is what I gave them. You know, because I wanted to say, okay, what is the future of wearable computing? Does it mean that remembering is, seeing is remembering, and remembering is recording, and recording is theft? And it opens up all those questions. Another line of work I did is called direct user interfaces, 1998. Direct manipulation, direct pedipulation. You know, manipulation refers to hand actuation, and pedipulation is foot actuation. And I'll make up a new word, corpusculation. Don't want it to sound too much like copulation, so maybe you have to kind of be careful with what declension of the Latin word to use, because manus means hand in Latin and so on. And so the idea is you have this within a feedback loop. It's direct manipulation or direct interaction, shall we say, within a feedback loop with proper balance between feed-forward surveillance and feedback surveillance. And then the other framing, I coined the term natural user interface in 2001, looking at nature-based natural philosophy, i.e. physics, natural elements like earth, water, air, fire, which are solid, liquid, gas, plasma, and natural use as in engaging in the real world in a natural way, and that's innate. So I created this reality window manager where windows are superposed on actual objects, so you can reach over and see a window superposed on something and touch that window and grab onto it and use physical space as an interactional framework. That's what I meant. And then Microsoft used this term a little bit later to mean something different than what I had originally intended. But Other examples are the hydraulophone, the mind mesh, look and think instead of point and click, and the iTap. And so then I wrote this paper, Being on Digital with Digital Media. And so being digital means being quantized in both the domain and range, presence of quantization error, quantization noise. The digital error is the first error that's named after that which we don't want, i.e. quantization noise. How about if we called the Iron Age the Rust Age? Or if we called the radio age the hiss age or the static age? Why are we talking about the quantization, the gritty noisiness of the era instead of what it actually does? So I kind of put forth this philosophy of being on digital. And one of my inventions, HDR, high dynamic range imaging, I put that forward as an example of being on digital, of capturing the floating point underlying variation that's continuous and getting rid of the quantization or the limitations that are typically of digital imaging with comparametric equations. So I talked about being continuous and about fluid user interfaces. Hydraulophone, immersive multimedia. Those who have brought their bathing suits are welcome to come to the fountain after class, after the lecture, and we can try this immersive multimedia. This is a little robot that we built, which allows you to interact and touch and grasp onto and hold waves. And so this is like a true three-dimensional television display that's truly physically in the environment with a spinning wheel there of light. And this is the concept, another one of my inventions, the chirplet transform, is a mathematical structure that we've illustrated here for teaching purposes. This is a microphone, and here we're sensing its capacity to sense. The robot here is sensing the capacity to sense. Here's a little wearable wristwatch. There's a microphone hidden inside that little stuffy there. And what we're seeing here is valence waves. And the valence wave, the inner product of the wave with its complex conjugate, is the probability of being detected by the listening device. So we can reach into quantum theory a little bit and have some fun. Now, I've got here, this is kind of my smartphone, which of course I've modified to make it do what I want it to do in the frequency bands that I like to operate in. But there's a waveform coming from it. And if I'm close to it, you can see that the signal's strong. And if I'm further away, you can see that it's weak. Actually, that's good. You can see it now. So here we are close. You can see it fairly strong. And as I come further away, it's weaker. The wave's weaker. And what happens if I put a big, thick stack? Does anybody got a big, thick stack of paper or something? How about a big physics book?
Fold it.
Yeah, we can fold that. Anybody got a big textbook? So you can see it's a little weaker now. Put that textbook on there. It's a little weaker still. Anybody got another book? How about that one? Yeah, there we go. See, we're starting to get the signal weaker. Can everybody see that? Now, if you take that away, that's when the signal's back stronger again. And you can see some of it's attenuated by that. You can see that. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of an early approach to augmented reality that I came up with in 1974, 42 years ago, which is wearable augmented reality without any eyeglasses needed. You can see that overlay there without special glasses. And now if I put my hand over this, see how strong it is now when my hand's blocking it? How much of that's getting through my hand?
How much?
None. So now that tells me that if I talk like this, if I hold my phone like this, we can put the lights back on. If I put my phone like this, I go, hello, I can't hear you. Well, what's happening is you're blocking the radio waves, and the phone has to crank up full blast and dose your brain with wave. But smart people hold their phone like this. Oh, that's much better. And now what happens is that the phone is just easy and very gentle because it's not having to blast itself at your head and waste all the battery power heating up your brain instead of using a little bit of battery power to actually transmit easily. And so that's an example. And this is valence waves. Another example. Another example is hydraulophone, underwater pipe organ. And this is one that we built for the Ontario Science Centre. I don't know if this one will actually work. We haven't even tested it since we got off the plane, right? Yeah. Yeah, you want to start it, and there might be a little initial. Is it going to play? There it is.
Maybe we should do it outside.
Yeah, so we'll bring it outside, but you got the idea anyway that you can play and understand with using water as a medium of interaction, and of course that gave us a discovery of actional integral kinematics, because we realized that pianos respond to velocity, pipe organs respond to how far down you press the keys, and hydraulophones respond to the area under the time-distance curve, which is a total new concept, the area under the time-distance curve. And here we are, area under the time-distance curve. This is a ball valve connected to a set of rings. Does everybody know what a ball valve is? You know, when it's across, no water comes out. When you turn it a little, it opens water. So if you push if the bar tilts 1 inch at the end for 10 seconds, it lets about the same amount of water through as if it tilts 10 inches for 1 second. In fact, the amount of water that comes out of that valve is equal to the area under the time-distance curve. And that's a new concept. Hydraulophone gave birth to a new concept, distance. You take the derivative, you get velocity. Take the derivative, you get acceleration. What comes after that? Derivative of acceleration? Jerk, excellent. And again? Yeah, snap or jounce, and then crackle, and then I call it poppycock, because by the time you take that much derivatives, it's almost all noise. Snap, crackle, and poppycock. Remember that. And so now we have a basic framework for a new kind of kinesiology, kinematics. So kinematics is normally distance and its derivatives, but now kinematics is distance and its derivatives and integrals. And so that gave rise to this new kind of fitness, because now I can measure the absement. So you try and do this thing on the rings and it sprays water on your head, and do pull-ups on this bar, and if it tilts a little bit, tilts more, it sprays more water. And then instead of water, we put a little app that just integrates and gives you a number based on how much absement there is, and you try and do your pull-ups with minimum absement. And then we put on the meta glasses and put a racing game where you're driving a race car down the track, and you got to do pull-ups and steer while you're doing the pull-ups, and this thing is the steering mechanism. So that's an integral kinesiology or integral kinematics. So that's just another invention. That's another startup waiting to happen. And I've got all these startups waiting to happen, by the way, and I'm open to collaboration on all of these. So if there's anybody here that's interested in kind of working on these things, I've got this little app here running, and it measures the tilt. And maybe you can hold the mic here. And so I've got this little thing here. And so that's a Wearable. I don't know if you can hear that. Let's try and use it. So we have this wobble board that's highly unstable. Countdown so you can start it yourself. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. 1, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 10 good push-ups with an abdomen of 14. So that's 10 good push-ups with an abdomen of 14. So, if anyone wants to try to beat that, that would be fun. We can come up. Feel free to give it a try. Anyone want to try it?
Give a shot. Someone who's there. Come on. Oh, okay, there's a volunteer. Nice. Do the other way.
Oh yeah, maybe go this way, that way, yeah. So now we'll start. So we'll stop and then start. Okay, get into push-up position and let it count down.
Put our hands on it.
8. Yeah, get your hands on the board. Okay, ready? And wait till it counts down. 2, 1, game on. Right down to the board if you can. Yeah, that's good. That's not bad. Right down to the board. Good. That's good, 75. That's not bad for a first try. And as you continue to practice, you can get the absent down lower and lower, and so on. And I've also got these rings here, and we can take that out, and I've got some rope and hang it from a tree. And after the session, we can do the rings game, which is the same thing. And that, on the left, there's a... So we just hang the rings from the fire escape stairs or so and do a little bit of exercise between computing sessions. And so the alternator there, it's an automobile alternator that's both a sensor and generator, and it throws some curves at you and you feel the bumps in the road. So you're driving this virtual reality game and you got to steer right or steer left and you feel the bumps in the road coming. You got to basically hold your position and correct error. And that's kind of the fundamental idea. Here's another variation of it, wrestling with a robot, water robot. And so you got to deadhead that jet. And there's a fountain here at Stanford that actually has a pretty strong jet to deadhead, but it can be deadheaded with a single hand. So you can deadhead it with one hand. This robot tries to do evasive maneuvers while you're trying to deadhead it. And obviously, if you come into the jet at the base, you can't get the strength to deadhead it, but if you come from further back as you come up on it, you can, and then it's trying to evade you. And so this gets the idea of water over internet protocol. So here's 2 robots that interact at different places, and you can have a water fight with somebody in another country, for example. So we call that WOIP, water over internet protocol. And this is an example of immersive multimedia. I define immersive multimedia roughly or approximately as a multimedia experience that sort of more or less requires you to bring a bathing suit and towel. It's an example of something for which I coined the term natural user interface. And the idea is natural interfaces, metaphor-free computing, reality user interfaces. And the hydraulophone is an example of that. My kindergarten teacher said there's 3 kinds of instruments, strings, percussion, and wind. And I said strings are one-dimensional solids, matter. Percussion is 2-dimensional membrane or 3-dimensional bulk solid, and wind is gas. So we've got 1D solid, multi-dimensional solids, and gas. So I said, like the 3 states of matter, solid, solid, and gas. Strings, percussion, and wind. And so I said, well, something's missing there. And how about I invent a new kind of instrument? And then she said, don't be crazy. And of course, I asked some physicists and engineers, and they said, well, water's not compressible. You can't make it into an instrument. And I said, well, if water's not compressible, then the speed of sound in water needs to be exactly equal to infinity, which it isn't. So water is compressible to some degree, but just not on the scale that we normally have. These bulbs here hold about 3,000 pounds per square inch pressure, and the necks are about 750 psi. And we have the water hammer hydraulophone. And this is just a little fun at the beach here. And if that experience wasn't immersive enough, so this is how we spend our Canadian winters. was minus 20 was the actual temperature with a wind chill of minus 40 degrees. And this was, we were the headline act for the Prime Minister and the Governor General at the North America's largest winter festival. So this was a lot of fun. And so this is a polyphonic embouchure is the concept underlying here. The instrument has multiple mouths. Oh, there's a mechanism here whereby the sound comes from vibrations in liquid alone. And I'll pass this around. This is due to the effects of modern printing technology. And Max here, stand up. Give everyone, Max a big round of applause here. He's a resident mechanical engineering genius. So if anybody here knows about Navier-Stokes equations, boundary value problems, Strual numbers on bluff bodies, join our team. Pass that around. This is in a startup we're working on. We sell these to water parks all over the world. We've got one at Legoland in Carlsbad, California. We've got them, some of the biggest makers of water parks and so on, licensing this technology. And we put them in cultural centers and civic centers around the world as sculpture and interaction design. And this is the main centerpiece of the Ontario Science Centre. They took in 240 applications from around the world, and they picked the top 40 of us and gave us each a couple of $1,000s to design a maquette. And then they brought the top 10 of us in, and they asked us what we wanted to present. And I said, and the other 9 asked for, just a room with a PowerPoint presentation. And I said, just give me a garden hose outside. And the other 9 all did their presentation in a business suit. I did my presentation in a bathing suit outside, connected to a garden hose, and they loved it. And so this is the final piece that was installed. So you can see here we have immersive multimedia, and this is an example, another example of water over Internet protocol. There's another piece here, and we've got all these things. We make our own underwater listening devices also. There's no hydrophones we've been able to find that really perform well in terms of localized listening to listen at exactly the right place. So we make our own hydrophones, make our own underwater listening devices that listen at exactly the right place to get the best sound. In terms of, this is a piece that we did for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. We made an outdoor classroom. It turns out that blind people have the same sense of touch that necessarily makes great hydrolophone playing. So there's a natural segue here into this outdoor classroom, complete with a little, this is the Nessie, her name's Nessie, like the Loch Ness Monster, she's the hydrolophone. And there's a little replica of her in this tactile classroom. There's a whole tactile map so that a blind person can feel where everything is in the park, including this little Nessie here, and locate it and go over and play on it. And my daughter, when she was 6 years old, really summed it up nicely. She did a little presentation at the water festival because somebody asked me how it worked, and I said, oh, why don't we let my 6-year-old explain? So she came up, and she explained it in terms of how you make it, because she's a true maker. So she put F equals C over 2 pi times the square root of A over VL, and then she brought the L over and got C over 2 pi whole squared times A over V, which is more or less how you make it, not so much how it works, but close enough. And so this is all about making things. And so when I grew up, radios and everything, you could see how they worked. This is a radio typically from the 1950s, and when I was growing up, people were throwing away a lot of these radios on the curb, and you could go by garbage morning and collect them. And I didn't have a lot of funds at the time, so I just mostly collected things from the curbside and rebuilt them and repurposed them and made them into new things. And so this is looking in the back of the radio. It had no back on it. You could look right inside it. And there's a schematic diagram on one side. Here's a complete diagram that outlines exactly how it works. And on the other side, there's a parts list. I thought, thank you, Westinghouse, for making it easy for me to understand how this radio works so that I can modify it and do things with it. And all these glass valves here are all transparent, and you can look inside them and see how they work. Little light bulbs, you know, and you can see. And television tubes were transparent then as well, and you could see inside them. And then in the 70s, we start to see this technology spying on us, microwave motion sensors and burglar alarms. And I wanted to see what it was spying. I thought, this thing's watching me. I want to know how it's watching me. What can it understand about me? So I open it up and take a look inside, and here's what I get. I noticed the manufacturer took the extra time to give us maps explaining how it worked. And here the manufacturer took the extra time to grind the numbers off all the chips to make it harder to understand how it worked. So we went from nice road maps like this to gouges and scratches like this. So welcome to the modern era where everything watches you and reveals nothing about itself. And so I got interested in video feedback, like many people, and you can walk around with a camera and point it at a TV screen. But I kind of did the opposite. I took the television camera and walked around with a television receiver, moving it around to pick up the television signal. And this is what I got in a long exposure photograph, moving a television receiver around the room tuned into that television channel. And then I realized I didn't need to carry the whole TV set around. I could just carry a light bulb around. So here's a 1.5 kilowatt light bulb connected to my lock-in amplifier. I built perhaps the world's most powerful lock-in amplifier with a 2.5 kilowatt output, a television receive antenna terminals, and pick up the TV signal and then make it feedback. And when the light source is in view of the camera, it would glow more brightly, and when it wasn't, it would glow less brightly. And here's what I got. And then this is a little bunch of photographs from a film strip that are chained together as a GIF image. And so this is kind of what happens. The light bulb waves around and shows us what is there. And there is the amplifier from 1974. And I built that in a wooden case, which was probably a silly idea, but as a child I slowly learned. Luckily it didn't catch on fire. And here's 35 light bulbs on a stick waving through space, seeing the sight field of the camera. And this is what I call phenomenological augmented reality. And so this is AR from the 70s, wearable AR. This is perhaps the world's first wearable computer with a little shoulder strap to carry it around. And I discovered this concept, what I call sitting waves. Here's standing waves. Standing waves are like a skipping rope or a violin string gives you, with the nodes fixed, and the wave goes positive amplitude, negative amplitude, and so on. And then here's the waveform from my apparatus. And you can see it's moving here. It hasn't quite sat still. Down boy, sit. Good boy. There, sitting. That's what we call a sitting wave. And so that wave is just sitting still. And just as a comparison point of view, there's a standing wave on the left, and a standing wave is the sum of waves traveling in opposite directions. A sitting wave is the product of waves traveling in the same direction. And here's the apparatus. And here's some sitting waves, circularly polarized radio wave visualization, which kind of got into as a visual art form, creating visual art. Of course, you got to have hello world for a wearable computer. Here it is on exhibit at the National Gallery. And it still works after 42 years. This is with some LEDs picking up the signal. There's Neil Harbison, the colorblind cyborg. And so the basic principle is that what we have is a space base rather than a time base. You can use an oscilloscope to see waveforms, but they're situated in time. and not necessarily aligned with space. And here I see a jumbled mess. That microwave motion sensor, which I'm trying to unlock its secrets, when I put it to an oscilloscope, it doesn't tell me much. But when I put it to the oscilloscope and move the oscilloscope, and the way I discovered this is my dad got me an oscilloscope that was broken, somebody was throwing away. That was about 40 years ago, and it was about 40 years old. It's about 80 years old now. And the sweep didn't work on it. So I started pushing it across the workbench to get it to sweep in my eye using persistence of exposure in my eye. And then I realized I discovered something very interesting, and that is what I discovered is what I call phenomenological augmented reality. That is to say, I had perfect registration because the registration occurs due to physics, not due to some laggy software, but the registration happens at the speed of light. And so the alignment between the real and virtual worlds occurs at the speed of light with exact accuracy. And so as a result, every time I swung that thing back and forth, it would follow up and down the peaks and valleys of that wave. And so here's a long exposure photograph moving the oscilloscope with the time axis turned off. And I see there, and of course, if I use my row of lights, this is a little robot that my 9-year-old made, and she can now see the radio waves. So here we have the electric field shown in green and the magnetic field shown in magenta. She made a little thing to flip the thing 90 degrees, and then we changed the dipole antenna to a loop antenna and sweep out the magnetic field. And so you can see here that we can see radio waves. So a lot of this thing is science as art. I've exhibited at Museum of Modern Art in New York, Stedelijk Museum, Smithsonian Institute, and so on, visualizing radio waves with smart fabrics. So I made in my childhood a lot of these smart clothes and smart fabrics. I made my own clothing, much to my mother's dismay, putting wire through the sewing machine and doing all kinds of crazy things like that. And this is, phenomenological augmented reality of a surveillance camera. Those lights are survey-luminescent and they light up when they're being watched. Here's the Oak Motel here in California, not far from here, where we stayed. And the world around us contains so many sensors. In our building, there's not a toilet or urinal or hand wash faucet that doesn't have a camera in it. Not just a camera, but a structured light source and a complete computer vision system. Usually the pixel count is fairly small, like 128 or 1024 pixels in a linear array. And usually the light source is a lock-in amp. But the pixels, a small pixel count, but it's essentially a lock-in camera because each pixel's locked into a certain carrier around 40 kilohertz or so. So here's the sight field of that camera. And this, as a form of visual art, allows us to see that which is unseen. So there's the old question, who watches the watchers? But I don't think anybody asked the more important question, who watches the watching? Who senses the sensors and senses their capacity to sense? And a meta conversation is a conversation about conversations. A meta joke is a joke about jokes. So I had this idea of meta sensing, meta vision, metavalence, which is the seeing of sight, the sensing of sensors and sensing their capacity to sense, and the vision of visualization. And then a robotic arm swinging that back and forth. Here's a microwave motion sensor, and we can see its waves. Here's a surveillance camera with a robotic arm tracing out its sight field. More generally, here is a new way of interacting with the world using a bacography or a vacography. And so what we have here is this concept of the space-time continuum. This is Jays Hansen. He's the Hollywood's #1 sort of graphical user interface designer. He did Hunger Games, Ender's Game, and so on. And he's one of our employees at Meta now. So here's a couple of examples. There's a conduit, an information conduit coming from the hand gesture to open an electronic door. Or we can have the information conduit that shows us how to find our way to class, how to not get lost, just walk down the pipe. And so it's all about different ways of interpreting the space-time continuum. So this goes back to a long history from the 70s and 80s, wearable eyeglass-based devices and things of that sort. And the ITAP principle, which you can read about in the IEEE spectrum, which says that the rays of light, if you look at the eye, the camera is pointing this way, and the eye itself is the camera. And that's what I discovered in the 70s. I found this thing gave me a headache, and then I found, no, I need to do something that makes it not give me a headache, and the eye itself has to be the camera with the ITAP principle. So wearable computing, wearable cameras, So I brought this to MIT to found the MIT Wearable Computing Project. I use this sort of as my portfolio for admission to MIT and successfully started this. Negroponte said, Steve Mann's a perfect example of someone deemed to be on the lunatic fringe but persisted in his vision and ended up founding a new discipline. And so one of my inventions was HDR, high dynamic range, which is here the welding helmet to see a dynamic range of close to 1 billion to 1. And Raymond Lowe here and myself and various others did this. You can see the 4 different exposures done in real time, cemented together. See welding image for the first time in human history. The tungsten electrode, including the tip, and the filler rod, as well as the glow of the molten metal. So just some examples. And of course, there's AR overlays. We did augmented reality overlays on top of that. Augmented reality. Here's the original work on the HDR invention and 35 years of digital eyeglass. Sixth sense, synthetic synesthesia of the sixth sense. I used to call it synthetic synesthesia of the sixth sense because we add new senses, and of course, we just got abbreviated to sixth sense. So I'll just quickly conclude by sort of wrapping through a couple of these inventions. The contact lens display from 1999, the implantable camera from 2000. There's the patent for it. 50 best inventions of 2009 Time magazine. Implantable. And then here is our Interaxon product that I was passing around, the brain-computer interface. It started out as a rough prototype, crazy in fact, and I brought this to San Francisco and I showed Kevin Kelly and he really loved it, and this was back in the 1990s, and then he talked about this quantified self. The wristwatch video phone, 1998, published on the cover of Linux Journal 2000. And finally, to conclude, I'll just conclude by saying a couple of things. Feedback delayed is feedback denied. Think about humanistic intelligence, not artificial intelligence. That is to say, think about surveillance systems. You have to have surveillance. The machine should reveal itself. It doesn't have to foist itself upon you when you don't want it to, but it should not conceal itself from you. The user, if the user so chooses, should be able to see and understand its state, if and when the user so desires. It doesn't necessarily have to constantly be bombarding the user with unwanted information, but it has to disclose when asked. Direct user interfaces, natural user interfaces, tinkery, tinkering is a form of inquiry, robotics, augmented reality robotics, and integral kinesiology. Finally, being digital is being quantized, and start using software as a general pejorative. If we can start thinking about software, and then I've got this concept of software-free computing, which we can talk about later on. So we have a little bit of time, a couple of minutes for questions and answers, and then I want to follow up outside with anybody because I'm available for the afternoon, and we can have fun by the fountain playing on this hydraulophone, or we can talk and meet. And I want to learn about what some of you guys are doing too. I have some fascinating work that I've become aware of. Guy Wang here is doing some really interesting work. I want to hook up with him and collaborate, and lots of other people I want to collaborate with who are in this room. So I want to connect with people today and start collaborations. I'm collaborating with Sean Fulmer. The day I came here, I just met him that day, and within a week we wrote a paper together and got it submitted, still waiting back. But we did this thing where we can feel radio waves using touch and haptics. So shoot me some questions.
You don't need to wait for the mic. There's mics up. Oh, okay.
So the hydraulophones that you made, are they generating sound acoustically or digitally?
So they're generating sound undigitally. So the way they generate sound is that there's a bluff body with water flowing, liquid flowing across it. So there's a little whistle or edge, and that generates edge tones. And some of them have pipes that reinforce those edge tones and get them to go the mass of the water in some conduit against the compression of the water in some cavity or reservoir equals, in effect, like an LC tank circuit that's resonant. And some of them are entirely acoustic and human-powered, so they don't have any electrical components in them at all. Others, due to customer demand, have amplification and listening devices. And so these hydrophones are like underwater microphones that listen. And then there's a little whistle in there that listener block, we call it a whistle, was a listening port, and that listens, and then that amplifies. And we often, like on digital processing, HDR, we often have a high gain channel and a low gain channel, and we merge those together. It's all sort of undigital processing with digital signal processing using swarm modulation to allow us to hear the subsonic and ultrasonic signals. So some of these go from, 0 cycles per second all the way up into the megahertz range, and take all that richness of the water and bring it to your ear, like a guitar effects pedal in a sense, but undigital, giving you the actual subsonic and ultrasonic sounds in the water together with the natural acoustic sounds in the audio range. We call that hyperacoustic instrument.
So, right there. So thank you for your talk. I'm wondering, so I love this idea of humanistic intelligence and the feedback delayed is feedback denied. And I think, in the diagram you showed earlier, you're thinking about this surveillance and, this main limitation of a lot of software systems today being that there is this gulf of evaluation of the user that we can't understand what the computing system is doing because it's not, showing us the state. And, as we were talking over lunch, you mentioned this is a problem too. And how do you think designers of computing systems, software systems, can do a better job of exposing state when you need it and then making it more transparent when you don't?
The first thing I would suggest is reading that humanistic intelligence paper that I wrote in 1998, humanistic intelligence concept, and to try to take that to heart. You see, like Raymond at Meta, the example of the Meta is a really good example of what we call anti-gestures. Like sensing anti-gestures, not gesture-based, it's anti-gesture-based. It's undigital. And so the big thing is to be undigital and to make that state incrementally discoverable and differentiable. And it's not so much about watching the user. I think people have become obsessed with watching the user with more and more intricate cameras, when you're peeing or washing your hands or watching the television, there's a camera watching you, and it's got so much data on you, and yet it's revealing very little about itself. And I think maybe we should have some way of making visible, and not in an annoying way or a distracting way, but when I push the button on my TV, it should immediately acknowledge the fact that it's been pressed so that I can then wait my 3 seconds rather than have to hit it again, not sure if it's been pressed.
About this is I'll just help Steve on this one too. So when I work with Steve, I create a wearable computer that I can wear every day, and it mounted depth sensing on the forehead. Right, that's the beginning of where I really think is useful. The only thing I did for that interface was to project a number called distance to my eye. Nothing more, nothing less, and it's continuous. 60 frames per second to a point of my eye, I cannot detect the difference. And that is what I think Steve has mentioned. As long as you can constantly observe and allow you to know what is going on with the system, to me, it's just purely a number. It's much more powerful because from there, I become superhuman for like a week. I can know distance so well. It rewire my sensory. So right now, approximately 2.5 meters approximately. Right. At that time, I get 2.54. It's like, wow, I get the extra centimeters of accuracy by wiring my brain through the sensory. That's why the direct input throughput system, if you don't close the loop, thing about sensor input is the depth, the output, what do you see, right? If it's a color, it's a digit, as long as it's continuously observable and it's to my eye and it's in every day, that interface will be much more successful than having a cell phone you have to pull up. You have a depth sensor, you have to click a button to drag and drop every single thing before you get a number. That makes a huge difference when it comes to a wearable computing. It has to be direct, but not like through a set of interface of steps. And that's what it means, from my understanding, by doing it every day as well. Right.
Yeah, I think that's a really good explanation. Like wearable computing, by its very nature, tends to bring us towards the notion of humanistic intelligence. Wearable computing is that first step towards humanistic intelligence. And I always would say that we have smart things. We've got smart light switches, smart toilets, smart elevators, smart TVs. How about smart people? Like why not put some of this intelligence on people in the right sort of way, so we get this good impedance match. I like to say that technology is a runaway monster that needs to be tamed with a piece of itself. We get all this stuff around us, but it's really annoying. Like I find myself not happy with most of the technology that I see in the modern world. I'm unhappy with it because I grew up building this stuff, inventing, designing, building, and making these things before many of them existed. And so I came to the idea that they would serve me and they would be responsive, and not that I would sit there and push something and wait and wait and wait. And I think that there's just too much of this bad design. And I think if you read that humanistic intelligence paper, I suggest as a starting point to read some of this work, and let's have some dialogue, let's have some more discussion about these principles and see if you disagree with some of them. Some of you are saying, well, no, not every user should be bombarded with everything. But I'm saying that at least when you want to, it shouldn't be hidden from you. I'd like to think of the Greek concept of aletheia. Aletheia means being hidden, and in Greek you negate something by putting a in front of it, so aletheia means not hidden. And so I think it's alethiometric systems is what I sometimes call it, systems that are unhidden, that if you wish to see them you can, but you don't have to be bombarded by them.
One more question.
We talked briefly about hiding information. I told you, like, my core research is going against everything you speak of, which is hiding information inside textile to a point where a person doesn't know he's actually wearing a digital form of anything. So interaction just by natural touch and getting output also from the fabric itself without seeing digital forms. And we then, and my point is, people see there's a lot of things grabbing people's attention. They don't need this more information. But I think in your talk, there are 2 points that are not clear. So you're talking about the state of the machine, and that's important, even for the person who's not a researcher or he doesn't want to know more about the machine. Responsive machines and the state of the machine is important, but how it works, I think this is like a small group of people would be interested in knowing how it works. And maybe this is where an AR display or a layer of AR would be interesting. This layer would only be worn by people who are already interested in knowing more about the machine. So a machine, from my perspective, should conceal everything except its state and a main output. But how it works, it should be something that a privileged AR wearing person should only see.
Well, when I grew up, these radios and everything, they revealed everything to me, partsless, schematic, regardless of whether I applied for a developer license or something. There was the concept of developer and user, that distinction is, I think, corrosive to scientific pursuit. You see, I think there shouldn't need to be a distinction. It should be gradual. It shouldn't be digital or binary. There's a thresholding effect where you don't get to know how something works until you apply to become a developer. Well, I want to take that small increment, the curiosity of just take a peek inside. Oh, no, okay, that's fine. Or maybe, yes, I want to go deeper. It should be undigital. I think the distinction between developer and user should be undigital. It should just be fluidly flowing. So if I want to know more, I can peek more. In fact, maybe the machine should even sense that I want to know more about it and give me more. Like if I've got that quizzical look, maybe it gives me more revealing about its state or something, So it's not bombarding us unnecessarily with state, but it fluidly shows us more and more state gradually without having to take a jump, abrupt discontinuity of having to actually put on some special device to see it.
Okay, let's thank Steve one more time.
But anyway, you've got the human and the machine, and the humans have senses and effectors, and the machines have sensors and actuators. And so you might say that there are a total of 4 signal flow paths. Humans and computers have their inputs and outputs. But I specifically in HI theory is we segregate those portions of the computer's output that are going into the human and those portions of the human that are going into the computer, because some of those senses that we have sense the environment around us, and a portion of that sensory capacity is devoted to sensing the computer. So I've specifically segregated those elements. And in particular, when we're being watched, that's called surveillance. That's a French word. What does that mean in English? Does anybody know English, French here? And how to translate it into English? Surveillance, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire en anglais? Yeah. Yeah, it's a French origin word, but give me like a really nice English word that sort of. Yes, overlooking, or a really good English word is oversight. Overwatching or oversight. And so surveillance is overwatching. And so when we're being watched over as suspects or whatever, or simply the machine's watching us. And so that's surveillance. And in control theory, we have this notion of controllability and observability, and you need both of them. The counterpart to this is surveillance. That's a word that I made up. Ça veut dire en anglais undersight. And so we have here these 6 flow paths, and you need all 6 of them in order to have a successful implementation of HI. If one of them is missing or impaired, then that's a problem. Now, where the problem most, then it captures everything with a fisheye lens, and it's got sensors in it that senses all kinds of physiological and environmental qualities. And then Microsoft kind of grabbed onto this idea a few years later, and then Momoto actually made it into a successful product. And we can think of these as scale here. You know, we can think of this in terms of scale. At the origin, I've got bits, atoms, and genes. And further out, bits is computer science. As we go further from the origin, atoms is geography and physical sciences, and genes, beams, memes, and the social sciences. And so we've got these 3 axes. Alpha, because atom is a Greek word, and bits is beta, and genes is gamma. And so these 3 axes represent the physical and social, political, and computational scale of things. So a smart city comes, the word urban, you know, is a Greek concept of city. And then we've got province, country, or state, country, earth, universe, and so on. And coming in, we've got neighborhood, street, building, clothes, body, organs inside the body, cellular biology, and we have what's inside. And the green stuff is the environment. That's what surrounds us. And I've colored in flesh tones our own body, which is not the environment. That's us. I call it the environment. And this whole scale, I'll call it the environment. Just take the first 2 letters off the word environment. So the environment is the environment and the environment. In other words, the physical scale that we're looking at here. And then we've got the social political scale, which is surveillance versus surveillance. Surveillance is the small individual, couple, family, team, community, corporation, nation, world government, and even the law of outer space. It arises is in valence. If you take the word surveillance and take away the first 3 letters, it just means sight or watching, valence. And in particular, just to make a point of this, I made a piece, an art installation, that violates the principle of humanistic intelligence because it's so commonly done in industry now. In fact, I grew up when I could understand things and they were easy to use and everything was immediate. My computer booted in a fraction of a second and everything was instant. And then we sort of entered the dark ages of computing when things became bad. And I think that to facilitate that, to show that, I made a digital light switch. Push once to turn it on and push once to turn it off with a random 3 to 5 second delay, but sometimes up to 10 or 15 seconds even. You know, the delay was kind of random. And so then with a 90% batting average, so that about 10% of the time I'd ignore the press. And so people would come into my office, they'd push the light switch and nothing would happen, and they would push it again, and then I could say, "You idiot, you just turned the light on and off again. You have to push it and then wait." And they would ask me how long, and I'd say, "Well, you know, maybe 3 to 5 seconds, but sometimes you have to wait a little longer." And so this is what I was thinking of machines of malice, the digital light switch, being digital. Now my daughter, my 6-year-old daughter, made this understandable because everybody was saying, what does surveillance mean? What does surveillance mean? So I said, what's there to not understand about that? And in fact, we created, this is a necklace I made back in 1998. And I made it to look like a surveillance camera. And
an honor to be here.
Fun to be here. And so I want to talk a little bit about nature and technology, wearable computing and augmented reality, and humanistic intelligence is the main framework, HI, humanistic intelligence, and surveillance systems. So first, I just want to briefly mention some of the ventures that have come out of this philosophy or way of thinking. Meta, augmented reality eyeglasses, we raised 73 million. And our chief technology officer, so I'm the chief scientist and one of the co-founders, and I have here another co-founder with me, Raymond. Do you want to stand up? And big applause for Raymond.
Hi, everybody. Well, I've been working with Steve for the last 10 years. It was a really interesting venture. You see, first day I saw him wearing this into the class and tell me he can see Wi-Fi. I'm not going to ruin his talk, but definitely he can see beyond a lot of things we can see today. And I'm very glad to be here. And if you're interested in Meta, come say hi to me today, and we're hiring.
Yes, we're looking for very, very smart people and creative people. And then another company that we co-founded that I was involved with, myself and some of my students and so on, we founded Interaxon, brainwave sensing company, and raised 17 million. This is our product here. I'll just grab that for a second and pass this around. So we sell this in Best Buy stores across North America now, and Indigo and so on. And this is a transparent version, so you can see inside it. The ones that we sell are, different colors, but usually not transparent. But anyway, I'll pass this around so everybody can see. It's got 5 electrode points on the front that contact, and then you can plug additional electrodes into the back for various areas. And it doesn't require, many of you have seen pictures of me where I shaved off my hair and bonded a skull cap permanently to my head with implanted electrodes. But you don't really need that. This will work with a big fuzzy hairstyle, and you don't need any electrode gel. It just slips on comfortably and easily and quickly. Another company, Visioner Tech, we're doing HDR, vision, and splash tones. We make underwater pipe organs, underwater musical instruments, sort of an early example of a natural user interface, and Lucent HDR welding to see welding vision. All of these companies are founded from one key principle: humanistic intelligence. Instead of AI, we have HI. And this is from a paper that Ray Kurzweil, the chief engineer of Google, Marvin Minsky, the father of AI, and myself, the 3 of us, wrote in 2013. That humanistic intelligence arises by having the human being in the feedback loop of the computational process in which the human and computer are inextricably intertwined. And this creates an intelligence that matches our own biological brain, something more powerful emerging from this, namely a synergy between human and computer that makes this sort of super intelligent cyborg being. So it's a fundamental concept that's based on, if we look at the 6 signal flow paths between human and machine, think the human I've denoted as a circle because people are kind of round, and the computer I've denoted as a square because computers are kind of angular, but without loss of generality here. I mean, typically computers are built into clothing, so they're also round and squishy.